Hello, and welcome to the Short Story Workshop. In each episode, we read a short story and then we discuss it. I'm Mel, and I'm here with Matt and Simone. This week, we're going to talk about my story that I wrote called The Lonely Fisherman, which is part of our sequel challenge. So we all wrote a sequel to one of the stories we talked about on the podcast, and I chose The Little Mermaid.
All right, will you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes. It is about a fisherman. Everyone's like, you should get a wife. And things just go downhill from there, really. Here is The Lonely Fisherman by me, Melody. In a little village over the hills on the serene southern coast lay a village famous for its fishermen. Fishermen went out in yellow boats all day, and in the evenings brought back nets crammed full of shining silver pilchards. Each fisherman's return to the harbour caused a flow of excitement among mothers and fathers and aunties and uncles and wives. They would all look through the nets together to see which pilchards would be the best to bake into stargazy pie. Stargazy pie is a ghoulish favourite of fishermen. Fish heads poke up from the pastry, dead eyes turned skyward. The last fisherman to return to the harbour was the youngest and would struggle to find a place for his little yellow boat, dwarfed by all the others. Since his elder brother found a wife in another village, he worked alone. He did everything by himself. He raised the sails and lowered the nets and fished and fished and fished. Every fish caught in his nets agreed if they must be caught, they were glad it was by the youngest fisherman. He always said a prayer of thanks before ending their suffering, and only took what he needed to survive. This fisherman harboured a secret longing for music more elegant and sophisticated than bawdy sea shanties. He liked tragic ballads or lovelorn arias. The others would tease if they heard him singing, so he made sure to sail out of earshot. This was why his boat was always last to harbour. As he sang, he liked to close his eyes, feel the gentle rock of the waves, and imagine swimming through trailing fronds of seaweed. Rainbow clouds of fish would swirl around him, jellyfish would flash their lights in greeting. He'd swim to where the water grew warm, and the seabed glowed in coral-bright splendour. The best days were those where the sea turned turquoise, and the sun sparkled off its surface, brighter than 1,000 jewels. At sea was where he felt most at peace. No matter how far he sailed from the others, the bone-deep feeling of being watched lingered with the fisherman. Imagine the feeling one gets when walking down the road only to suddenly spot the round, begging eyes of a stray cat. The fisherman had this, but tenfold, and never spotted the cat. Sometimes he caught glimpses of peculiar long dark shadows in the water, and a flicker of shining silvered tail far too large to belong to a pilchard. Whenever he asked the other fishermen if they'd seen anything, they always dismissed it as a fatigued illusion. Poor young'un is seeing things again. Too much time on his lonesome, I reckon. He really ought to find a wife. On Sundays, his older brother came to visit. His wife was very beautiful with her tumbling curls of fair hair, but she barely spoke a word to the youngest fisherman, even though he tried every subject he could think of. The only thing she seemed to like was dancing, and the only one she ever smiled for was her husband. You should get married, said his brother. It would do you good. The youngest fisherman thought of the women he knew. They cackled together in groups and always seemed to be whispering secrets. Some of them looked at him with hungry eyes, full of expectations he was scared to contemplate. A wife would want money for dresses and dancing, so he'd have to sing less and fish more, but she could pack the fish he caught and make him stargazy pie. He gazed at his sister-in-law as she expertly rolled dough. That looks delicious, said his brother. We are lucky men. Her smile lit up the kitchen. She went up on tiptoe to kiss him. Maybe a wife wouldn't be so bad. The fisherman had gone quite far out. The day started fair, but soon angry clouds blotted out the sunshine. The bad weather seemed more prevalent of late. The waves churned against his little boat, rocking it so vigorously he could barely stand straight. The roaring wind carried an unusual musical lilt as it stung his cheeks. He hauled up the nets, muttering his prayers of thanks. A poor catch, but there was always tomorrow. The last net was very heavy. He struggled with the ropes, pulling and pulling with all his might. Perhaps he'd caught an errant shark following its dinner. His poor fingers would be better off if he simply cut the net free and went on his way. But the fisherman couldn't bear to think of the shark writhing inside the net, sinking hopeless and doomed through the storm-swept sea. He peered down to get a look at his unfortunate prey, but the swirling waves hindered his vision. At length, he finally hauled the net onto the boat's deck. A silvered tail too large to be a pilchard's protruded from one end. "Help me," said a whispery sing-song voice. "Help me, help me." The fisherman could scarcely believe his eyes. Joined to the fish's tail was the body of a beautiful maiden. She had long flaming red hair,
and peered up at him with eyes the colour of frosted sea glass. Pearls of water ran over her skin and dripped onto the deck. With shaking hands, he cut the net with his pocket knife. Once done, the ropes fell around the mermaid, for that is the name of creatures like her, in a circular tangle. Her hands seized a handful of his shirt. For a moment the fisherman thought she would drag him overboard into the water. He closed his eyes, trying not to shiver as he felt a tug at his jaw. Salty sweet lips brushed against his mouth. She said, "It is my dearest wish that you come and live under the sea as my husband, for you are very handsome." He did not mind the fish's tail, not if she continued to look at him with such beguiling eyes. In his mind's eye he saw a pretty cottage with a shell-encrusted door and vibrant strands of seaweed waving from the windows. A wife, at last, and a pretty one too. Awestruck, he replied, "Oh, I would give anything." She ran a finger down his cheek. "If you wish to become my husband, you will live up to 300 years. However, you must surrender your immortal soul." Under the sea, there would be no more tangled nets, no more unkind gossip, no more awkward Sunday dinners. The fisherman would be free to sing as he liked, swim as he liked. The mermaid wound her arms around him and kissed a path up his neck, tiny, insistent adorations. His immortal soul seemed like a small price to pay. 300 years seemed an awfully long time to live. He looked deep into her sea-glass eyes. Her hands were soft and smelt rich and grassy, like sugar kelp. Yes, he would marry her. There was no question. "I will return tomorrow," he promised, "and we will be married, as you wish." "Oh no," she said, "that will not do. We must be married at once, or not at all." He wanted to marry her very much. He couldn't bear the thought of waking up alone and full of regret. "But I must tell my brother and sister-in-law of the wedding, and surely you must have family to invite." The mermaid flinched as if he'd struck her. Not any more. There was a sudden jerk and lurch which threw them across the deck. Sharp wind stung the fisherman's skin. Rain blurred across his vision. Water began to rise up the sides of the boat. It wouldn't be long before it sank. He curled his fingers around the mermaid's and let her pull him into the cold, churning water. First he thrashed as it filled his lungs, but the mermaid pulled him close and stroked his hair and made soothing noises. The cold eased from his bones and he began to calm. They were under the water and he could see and hear and breathe. He kicked his legs in a clumsy attempt to swim. Curling columns of silvery pilchards stormed his lovely yellow boat as it sank toward the seabed. It almost looked as though the fish were the cause of its distress, which surely could not be true. An uneasy feeling rose in the fisherman's gut as he watched the fish chew at his ship. Flecks of wood and paint floated in the dank water. The mermaid dragged him to a drab, muddy plain at the very bottom of the seabed. On it stood a little cottage all by itself, built from shiny pebbles. It looked very handsome with its garden of bright, twisting corals. The fisherman imagined himself sleeping next to the mermaid inside a seashell. "Do you like it?" whispered the mermaid. A writhing mass of snakes suddenly surged up from the mud. The fisherman flinched back, but the mermaid laughed. "Hello, my little chickens." The aggression went out of the snakes. Their beady eyes closed as they enjoyed her thorough attentions. "Do not be afraid, they just want to play." The fisherman extended his hand as she did hers, but the snakes hissed and flicked their tongues at him. They did not look like they wanted to play at all. Inside the cottage the furniture was like he imagined, very grand and made of polished driftwood and seashells. "Marriage beneath the sea is very simple," said the mermaid. "We will simply say our vows and then drink this potion for health and happiness." "Can you not wait until—" "Drink," she ordered. "Drink, and once we are married we can share the joyous news with your brother. Will he not be pleased that you have found a wife?" The fisherman took the glass she gave him and peered doubtfully at the liquid inside. It bubbled and churned, a green too bright to be seaweed. "I love you," said the mermaid, and kissed him until he couldn't think. He let her pour the potion down his throat. He choked on its foul taste, and all the time watched the mermaid, her pretty eyes and long flowing hair. Suddenly he felt very, very tired. He closed his eyes and sank down, face pressed to the sandy floor. When the fisherman woke, he knew not where he lay. He squirmed upright in a great panic. Where was the ceiling of his hut, the cry of seagulls, the slanting light of dawn across his sheets? Bubbles danced before his eyes. He gulped, but instead of taking in air, he took in water. He tried to cough, but glugged yet more water. Felt refreshing, life-giving. Why wasn't he drowning? All at once he remembered the events of the previous day. The mermaid, the marriage. Had it all been a dream from being rocked to sleep in the sun? No. Both he and his boat were at the bottom of the ocean. He squirmed. Underneath him was a mattress made of pungent seaweed. As he went to swing his legs, he froze. He could not wiggle his toes. His body jerked to the side and he felt something heavy slice through the water. Panic gripped him. Where his legs should be, he saw a shining silver tail. He thought of fishtails piled up in nets in the factories, hundreds of them. His garbled scream brought the mermaid gliding to his side. She made hushing noises like she'd done with the water snakes. "You only said I would relinquish my immortal soul. You said nothing about my legs." "How peculiar you are, that you value legs over your very soul." "Return my legs to me at once. I thought I was marrying a good, honest maiden. This isn't fair." "Do not speak of fairness. A human took my sister. Why should I not be able to take a human if I want one?" "You have made me ugly." "Oh, my dear. Rest assured the tail becomes you, improves you even. You're much lovelier without those misshapen fleshy stumps." "I want to go home." A tear ran down his cheek as he thought of his brother and sister-in-law looking for him, mourning him, making Sunday dinner without him. He'd spent so long wishing for a different life, and now all he wished was to have his old one back again. His boat, his brother, his late parents' house with its creaky door and stale bread smell. "Don't cry, dearest. Life under the sea is not so bad. We are married now, so you may call me Nerissa." Nerissa liked to make potions in a great rusted cauldron. This horrified the fisherman, but whenever he muttered darkly about witches, Nerissa only laughed at him. She liked to play tricks, tiny pinching crabs in his food, and snakes in his bed. Then she'd say it could not be helped, she was a witch after all. He still yearned to go home, but Nerissa said humans wouldn't know him anymore. They would catch him in a net and put his head in a stargazy pie. When he saw his reflection in the water, he saw she was right, they would not recognise him. His hair was long now, and his face sharper. His eyes were frosted like hers, and of course there was his tail. It felt like he was occupying a stranger's body, though it was much easier to swim. Before long he could catch any fish he liked. Much of the fisherman's time was spent gathering ingredients for Nerissa. She acquired many strange things for her cauldron. Poisonous fish, rare plants, and nipping coral polypi were favourites of hers. She also required certain things from the undersea bazaar. The fisherman took a fishing net full of potions to trade, which did things such as making hair grow thicker or smoothing unsightly wrinkles. Most of the stalls at the bazaar carried items which looked as if they'd been salvaged from shipwrecks. Chipped glass bottles were filled with cutlery, pens, and brass buttons. One of the stalls carried a wooden chest displaying a wreath of white lilies and pearls. Unlike the other items, it did not look man-made. The mermaid manning the stall smiled at him, which was unusual. Other merfolk gave him a wide berth, only grudgingly bartering when they saw the potions. The word human followed him. This mermaid's face was less elfin, and her tail did not shine as much as the others. She had an interesting, knowing look about her. "Is it a crown?" "Nerissa sold it to me." "How much is it?" "More than you can afford. I doubt she wants it back." "Why not?" "You're that young man with the lovely singing voice. If you sing for me, I'll tell you Nerissa's story." The mermaid introduced herself as Coralise. She led the fisherman to the nearest cliffside and showed him the rocks where the sunshine fell just right for sunbathing. The fisherman longingly gazed towards his home. He could see yellow specks of boats in the distance. Strange to think of his brother and the other fishermen still doing the same old routine while his life had been completely transformed. "There's nothing better than lovely music on a warm day," said Coralise, as she stretched out on the rock. "I'll have the one about the hurricane of heartbreak to start." "You know it?" Coralise glanced at him from beneath her eyelashes. "I know all your songs." The fisherman sang for her until he lost track of time. His voice felt like the one part of him that had not changed, and he was glad for it. He carried on singing until the sun began to set. Coralise did not stop him. She simply lay back with her eyes closed and listened with a small smile on her face. "Nerissa will start to wonder where I am." Coralise opened her eyes. The glow of the sunset flushed her skin candy floss pink and orange. "Do you love her?" The fisherman shook his head slowly. He tried to love Nerissa, but was all too frequently terrified of her. "Good." "Why is that good?" "She's mad. She used to be a princess, but she was exiled for using dangerous magic. They said she was trying to bring back her sister's lost soul." The fisherman thought about Nerissa staying awake at her cauldron long after he retired and fell asleep. She conjured day and night. Sometimes he would see burns on her from where a dangerous potion had dripped onto her skin. A voice like yours deserves better. A voice like yours deserves everything, whispered Coralise. Then she kissed him. Slowly, carefully. Not even waves splashing up his back or seaweed tangling around his tail could distract him from the warmth of her lips. Their bodies pressed together. A distant splash of something breaking the surface drew his attention. Nerissa looked out of the water at him, her pretty face ugly with anger and hatred. The fisherman's bones turned cold. Knots of hissing snakes surrounded them, rearing up from the water and flicking out their forked tongues. Do not imagine I will lie down and turn into sea foam, you ungrateful wretch. I chose you, and this is how you repay me. I thought you would be a wife. Did not think you were going to turn me into a fish and make me a slave. I am your wife, you despicable landslug. Coralise looked on in horror as Nerissa advanced, tail flicking through the choppy waters. She seized the fisherman's arm. And as your wife, I think I should meet the sainted brother you're so obsessed with. You said he turned me into a pie, which is exactly what you deserve. He struggled, but she'd had her tail far longer, and he couldn't win against her superior swimming. In the end, all he could do was lie limply as she pulled him along. Nerissa, please. The rocks and cliffs and beaches changed into familiar shapes. He thought longingly of his sunken ship. Spread out in front of him were a bevy of boats from all different villages. They were on their way back to the harbour. Nerissa arched up out of the water and performed a neat porpoise dive. The resulting splash drew the attention of the men. The fisherman ducked into the water until only his eyes were above the surface. Maybe he could swim away while Nerissa was performing her circus act. As the ships drew in, she blew a kiss to the nearest one. Don't be shy, she cooed. Tell me which one's your brother. The fisherman looked up. By now the boats were gathered in a cluster, most of them staring at Nerissa. Nerissa shoved him. On every side, familiar faces of men he'd known since he was small stared down at him. Trev, who pushed him over in the playground. Tom, who stole his lunch money. Someone whispered his name. It was the first time he'd heard it in weeks. The ship shifted left and right, gradually clearing a path. His brother's ship was new, and the paint gleamed brightest of all, his wife's handiwork. His brother peered over the deck into the waves. Dark shadows on his eyes made him look older. It's you. It's really you. Tears gathered in the fisherman's eyes. He did not know where to begin. There was so much he wanted to say. Get on board. I'll give you a hand. You must be so weak. The fisherman flipped over in the water to show his long silver tail, so very like a pilchard's. Mother of God, saw his brother. What happened to you? Found a wife. His brother frowned, not following. Nerissa was no longer at his side. The fisherman searched for a flash of red hair among the other boats. Then he saw her. She was seated on the stone wall of the harbour. She ran her fingers through her hair so it could dance freely in the wind. Some of the fishermen drifted towards her. They shouted questions and lewd suggestions. Nerissa grinned in a way the fisherman knew wasn't good at all, then threw back her head. Out of her mouth poured the most beautiful melody. The notes perfectly complemented the rhythm of the waves and the creak of boats. The wind rose to carry her voice, and the sky darkened to match Nerissa's foreboding mood. The fisherman did not understand. Then he remembered the night they met, the storm, the rain, the boat sinking. Return to the harbour at once, he told his brother. It's dangerous. As if to give his words credence, a round of alarmed shouts went up. The fishing boats began to rock. When the fisherman dived below the surface, he could see swarms of pilchards moving in unnatural tandem. Frantically, he swam towards Nerissa as fast as he could. He fought the angry waves, the shoals of pilchards, and the lurching ships. Some of them were already beginning to sink. At the foot of the harbour wall, he saw crimson smears where Nerissa had dragged herself up the sharp stones. Spiky barnacles and slippery seaweed made for poor handholds, but they were the only ones he had. Taking a deep breath, he began to pull himself up. Waves crashed furiously against the wall, threatening to knock him down. His tail was a useless weight, slowing his progress as he clambered. By the time he got to the top, weather conditions turned severe. Rain poured from the sky with a ferocity he'd never known. The sea battered the harbour wall as if trying desperately to knock it down. There were shouts of panic from sea and land alike. Nerissa, he said. Listen, she carried on singing. I am sorry. You are my wife, and I have not acted honourably towards you. Nerissa caught her breath. Humans are all the same. How could my sister love them so? I cannot understand it. All you do is take our fish and break our hearts. So greedy, so wasteful. I did not know your heart was mine to break. You are cruel to me. I saved your life. I'm grateful, but I don't love you, Nerissa. I should never have agreed to marry you. I panicked. I thought you'd be my only chance. I was wrong, and there'll be other chances for you too. Do not flatter me. I am on my way to becoming an ugly old sea witch. Perhaps that is the destiny of unloved mermaids. The fisherman shook his head. Your sister chose to die rather than live on with her family. How could she love him more than us? How could she choose him? I don't know. Love? Love. Love is for fools. I want you to hurt like I hurt. Then maybe you'll understand. I won't. I'll just hate you, the way you hate humans. She gave him a withering look. You don't scare me. The temporary lull in the storm passed, and the wind and waves began their churning once more. The fisherman looked out and saw his brother's boat had stopped to rescue the crew of a sunken vessel. With more people on board, its weight would drag them down, and the sea would drag them under. He threw himself at Nerissa, intending to push her off the wall. Their arms locked together, and they tussled like crabs. Then the air whispered, Sister, sister. Nerissa froze. The fisherman pinned her arms behind her back, but did not yet throw her off the wall. The voice whispered through the air, ruffling their hair and raising their skin into goosebumps. Sister! This shout was for real. 4 heads surfaced below the wall and looked up at them. 4 lovely mermaids, their tails studded with oysters. Nerissa took a sharp intake of breath. Come home, said one. Father misses you. Look, we've brought your crown of lilies and pearls. We've already lost one sister too many. We shouldn't fight any more. I'll let you have the first song at the next ball. Nerissa stared down at them. I couldn't find a way to bring her back. The mermaid who looked the oldest said, very softly, I think she's content where she is, so you can come home now. Nerissa looked at the youngest fisherman. I thought we'd love each other. I was wrong. I don't think I can give your legs back, or your soul. That's all right, the fisherman said bravely. As long as I can go home, I'm content. They went their separate ways. Nerissa looked happy to be back with her sisters. She wasn't an unloved mermaid at all. The fisherman rescued the men whose boats had been wrecked in the storm. Some blamed him for what had happened, or thought spotting him was a bad omen. He wasn't always welcome in the harbour, but every Sunday his brother and sister-in-law went to the beach and gave the fisherman his share of stargazy pie. The fisherman lived his 300 years under the sea. Although he could never regain his human form, he watched over his brother's children for several generations. He was said to have the most beautiful singing voice in the ocean, a voice capable of calming even the most tempestuous storms.
Tell me what you both thought of this story.
I really liked it. It's a deviation from your usual style now, but I can still tell that you wrote it. It's got the distinct parts of your style hidden in it, below the surface. I like the way that you play on the original a lot, because we know it's a sequel, but we don't know how exactly until quite far in. You fold in a lot of things from The Little Mermaid into the story later on as you go on, which I quite like, because it's got that additional question of, oh, how is this related? And then you slowly realise the different ways that it is.
Oh, I'm glad you liked it. Out of interest, which parts of my style could you see in it? Because I tried so hard.
It's one of those subtle things, isn't it? It's hard to describe, but I think partially because the setting is very much something you would come up with. I think The Little Mermaid was perhaps similar to what you write in that regard anyway. And just maybe a bit in the dialogue or the way the conflict played out, it seemed like something you would write.
The tone is very you. It's got that kind of smoothness to it, which is, I find, often comes up in your stories. In case it's not already obvious, I also really, really enjoyed it. I thought it was great, and it had lots of really great scenes and bits of interesting setting, which I always think you're really good at. I liked how the conflict played out, not exactly how I would have expected it to, while still making sense. Just an enjoyable read.
I'm glad you said that, because I was really worried about the ending on this, actually. This was where I got stuck. It took me like a week to write the end.
But Mel, isn't it true that usually you write your end before the middle?
Yeah, but it's odd because those last sentences, right, where he, lives in the sea for 300 years or whatever, I had written those. It was like the bit before that I didn't know what to do with. So I knew like the very end, but I didn't know the bit before it. So I still follow my pattern, but it's like I didn't go as far back as I usually do or something.
You usually write the ending first. So is that just because you find it easier? Why?
So I usually write at the beginning, then I write the end. I would like to write the end because I like to know where I'm going. Because if I write an outline, I never stick to it. It keeps changing when I keep changing my mind about things, about different details. If I have a definite end point, that gives me something that's certain, and that helps me guide the story where I want it to go, rather than having a rigid outline, which doesn't help me much, because there's something wrong with my brain, I can't stick to outlines. But if I know how I want the thing to end, then I can stick to that.
Considering like half the writing community agrees with you, I don't think there's anything wrong with your brain.
Okay, that's good.
Like, that's kind of the nature of stories, isn't it? As you kind of get into them, get to know your characters better, that you do have that level of instinctually being able to change things is quite important. Like, it's important to be able to change your mind and to know that you're not a failure as a writer if you change during the process. Otherwise, you'd have everyone stuck on their first draft thinking that they can't go back and edit anything.
That's very true. I think what gets me is that I will sometimes come to a point in the story where I have a few different options, and then I find it quite difficult sometimes to select which one. This story was no different. When I got to the end, when I knew there was going to be a conflict, I didn't know what I thought should happen to Nerissa. I didn't know, like, I kind of knew where the fisherman was going to end up. I guess all my questions are all about, like, what should happen to her and what should happen to, because I never bring back Coralise. At one point I was like, maybe she should come back because it feels weird that she's just there for one scene. And then I was like, no, her being there for just one scene is something Hans Christian Andersen would totally do, so I can get away with it.
It's true.
And at one point I was going to have the fisherman's family play a bigger part in it as well, and then I decided that there was just too much going on and I needed to focus it down a bit, which is how it came to be what it is now.
That makes sense.
Quite a busy story, especially because you've worked on some things from the original. There's a lot going on. I think anything more would be too complex.
Yeah, or require more room than you have.
I was going to say at one point the fisherman's brother's wife was going to also be a mermaid.
That did occur to me when you first introduced her, with her not talking to anyone else. It was like, she's a mermaid, but then she wasn't.
Maybe she still is and I just didn't have time.
I mean, you thought it was like an aborted arc, like you just kind of stopped halfway through, but really it's a red herring, right?
Yeah.
You're just trying to deceive us.
The mermaid is here, or is she?
Yes.
So why did you choose The Little Mermaid to write a follow-up?
I chose it because something about the original story struck a chord with me. I think it was the mixture of, I guess, light and shadow. So you have the innocence of this young woman, this like falling in love for the first time, and then that's kind of tempered by the horror of going to the sea witch and making the deal and having her tongue cut out. Something about that is just, I like that mix of tones in things, and also I liked a lot of the themes. They appealed to me. I thought some of it was really romantic, and the ending upset me. So I guess it's a story that moved me emotionally, so that's why I chose it.
Makes perfect sense. Spite is a powerful motivator for us all.
Wouldn't you say the story is not as dark as the original? Because the dark has lots of things, like you mentioned, the tongue being cut out and, eternal pain and when you walk and things like this. Did you think about that at all? I
could have made it a darker story, but I didn't want to. Nerissa was going to be much more horrible than she was in the end at one point. I just felt like that's not the story I wanted to tell, and that I had empathy with her because she lost her sister, and I don't think it's really thought about much in the original. Like this in the original story, so the sisters go to the sea witch and trade their hair for a dagger so that the Little Mermaid can stab the prince and live. She doesn't, because she loves him, and I wondered if they would understand that, and also how they would feel about going to all that work and then she's just like, nah. Like, we understand because we know that she loves the prince, but if they didn't know that, then I don't know what they thought. Maybe they thought he kidnapped her. Maybe they thought she was brainwashed. Maybe they thought the sea witch forced her to do it. Like, there's all these possibilities that could have happened.
I mean, to me it makes sense to almost combat some of the darkness of the original, because that felt to me at least part of what you were trying to tackle. It's the idea of healing from something like that is kind of partially what the story, or at least Nerissa's side of the story, is about. So it wouldn't have made sense for her to be as dark, because she's not a dark character, she's a grieving character. So I kind of agree with you that there would be something very odd about making her actively malicious in quite the same way.
I also felt annoyed at the original because the message that if your first love isn't worth it, so turn into sea foam just feels bad. I don't think that was wholly intention, but you could look at it like that, and that made me just cross. So you can try again. You can, it doesn't have to all rest on this one person, even if you've set your heart on them.
Wise words. I guess that partially answers the question of what inspired you to take the route down the story that you did, given, well, obviously it's a classic tale, The Little Mermaid, and there have been a lot of adaptations and stories to play with over the years, so I guess that's why you wanted to do the version that you did that was kinder to the original characters and gave them more of a redemption.
I took the original and I flipped it around. I was more interested in the underwater world than the human world. So in the original story, the Little Mermaid is fascinated with the human world and she wants to be a human. I was like, okay, what if I kind of did it the other way around and had someone who loved being in the sea and wanted to be in the sea? Not specifically a mermaid, but just somebody who was interested in that world like the Fisherman is. So that's where I started from. Some of the other stuff that I changed came in later. So the other thing I guess that's different from the original is that Nerissa goes with her sisters, whereas the Little Mermaid did not go with her sisters. So I was like, let's take this and just switch it around. And also, it's the idea, I guess, that the main character, the Fisherman, doesn't fall for her as well. Like,
but no, it is an interesting point with him not falling for her, because I think it goes. Obviously, the original story is telling a lot in a short space of time, but at the same time, I think because of the legacy of The Little Mermaid, up to a certain extent, it kind of plays into this idea we have a lot in the modern world about falling in love immediately with people, even though in the original story, the prince and the Little Mermaid don't actually spend that much time together in a lot of adaptations before she has such strong feelings for her, and you're kind of playing with that idea of where it's more the idea of Nerissa and the wife and the societal expectation that he's leaning into because of his loneliness than actually her as a person, and then the consequences of having that view or choosing to love someone just because you feel like you have to rather than because you genuinely love them.
Yeah, right. So when he gets to know her, he doesn't love her.
Yeah.
But he falls for what she could be, the possibility of her. And I sometimes think that that's what people fall for rather than the actual person. And I thought that was an interesting, if a little bit sad, kind of idea to take forward.
It is. But also, it is a very understandable one, and it kind of fits in with his love of the sea, in that he loves the sea, he wants a life in the sea, and she's a symbol of that. Like, she's half his world and half the sea, so.
He's like, what do you mean you're not going to make me pie? You don't have pie under the sea? What the heck? This is not how I imagined married life would be. I'm just your errand boy now. This is humiliating.
I did like your undersea settings, though. I always think you've got a real knack for the settings, as I think I have said, like, both in the little details, like the fact that his boat was yellow, and you could just imagine his little boat always being the last one in, which already sets the scene so well for him being seemingly behind his peers in married life and kind of lonely. And then there was the undersea market, which is just a great concept. Do you have any tips for writing setting, as that's something you always do so well?
Thank you. I'm glad you like my settings because honestly, I really enjoy writing them as well. I think it comes from the fact that I like to explore in real life, and that is just always fun to me. So the setting in this story is based off a real place. So it's based off a fishing village in Cornwall called Polperro. Don't know if their fishing boats are yellow though, but they are an old fishing village. They used to catch pilchards, and fishermen's wives would then pack them in factories. You can go to one of the old factories. It's a museum now, and see how they used to live. And so that was kind of the basis for The Fisherman. I used the history of that village shamelessly. It's also, you can tell it's set in Cornwall because they're eating stargazy pie, which is just, ugh, why would you? But apparently fishermen like it.
I couldn't tell that made it in Cornwall, because my gut reference for stargazy pie is that it's what I'm forced to eat every single 23rd of December. It's a family
Oh,
tradition.
I see.
It started because I was grossed out by stargazing pie, so of course my dad just kept making it.
Yeah, you have the Cornish to thank for that then. The market was kind of based on two places. The market in Stardust, and then there's a city in Final Fantasy XII called Rabanastra, which I was kind of thinking of as well. I find video games can be really helpful for settings because the creative settings in video games are often underrated by people.
I think settings is one of the few things you can do in video games that you can also do in books in a very similar way, if that makes sense. Like, obviously, video games are more visual, but you can build up a setting to be this really impressive place, and that really enhances the experience of playing a game. And it does so in a similar way to having a really strong setting can enhance reading a book. Whereas other things like plot and character, it gets a bit complicated in video games because you have to think about having a player and things like this.
They help me when I'm writing because if I want a fantasy setting, then I might imagine a real place, but if I do, then I'll mash it up with something that I've seen somewhere else as well.
I suppose it's kind of similar to the way that you might make plots or characters, and that you take things you like that you've seen other people do and you kind of combine them together, right?
You do definitely have a returning mermaid, sea creatures, sea vibe in your work that you come to.
Mermaids, I like that they exist all over the world in some myth somewhere, and they can be so many different things. They're so versatile, a bit like the sea is as well. The sea is a great setting because it can be gentle, beautiful. It can also be horrific, stormy, absolutely your enemy. I find something about that really interesting, and in real life, I like the sea. I like being there. The air is good to breathe. It makes me feel calm. After the first lockdown in the UK, I went to the beach for the first time, and I could feel the tension in my head just easing away because I was so stressed about everything. So I guess for me personally, it's a calming place. And in terms of like the stuff you can do with it narratively, it's really diverse. So there are two reasons that I really like writing about the sea and stuff that can happen in the sea. There's also so much in the sea that we don't know about. Like, the deepest oceans are still unexplored. We don't know what's down there. Could be anything down there. And occasionally you'll get like massive monsters just showing up on cameras, like mega sharks or whatever. That's just so cool.
I think also it's nice in-between blend of the real world and the other, because we know the sea as a place exists, and most of us have been there and seen it, or at least been to the beaches. But at the same time, there's also so much about it we don't know, and there's this, because it's water, there's such this obvious barrier between like what we consider our world, our normal lives, and something else that's different and kind of mysterious. So it's almost like doing fantasy, but keeping it a bit more grounded, I think.
Yeah, in between. Yeah, happy to write about mermaids. I could carry on writing about mermaids. Maybe I will. Maybe I should.
So which aspect of the doing this story did you find the most fun then? Was it the setting or something else?
Yeah, it was the setting. I loved thinking about the market underwater and all the stuff that would have come from shipwrecks. I loved thinking about the fisherman just kind of floating on his boat going, I wonder what it's like under the sea, and thinking about how beautiful it is. I love the actual description of Nerissa's house, which looks innocuous, but then suddenly there's sea snakes everywhere and you're like, oh my god. Yeah, I enjoyed the setting a lot, and I hope that I made the most of it.
I feel like you did personally, but I'll leave it up to other people to judge. What was the hardest thing to do that you found in this story? Because obviously it is entirely your own original story, but you were also sequel challenging Hans Christian Andersen and his style. So what would you say were the hardest and easiest parts about his style to emulate?
The easiest part is what I thought would be the hardest part, the descriptions. So if you read his stories, they're quite vivid. They use colour a lot, and they're just very, very beautiful and poetic to read. And I thought, oh no, I'm never going to be able to write those. And yesterday I read back the first part of my story and I was like, I think I did an okay job. The hardest part was I read a lot of his stories to try and get the feel of them, the structure, the way they were. I don't think I quite had it down as a formula though. Like, he wrote a lot of stuff, and even his fairy tales, there were marked differences between them. So, for example, The Ugly Duckling has got this quite long-winded part where about, you know, this very long string of terrible things that happen to the duckling. And I didn't think I could write something that was that kind of round about the houses just to make the same point. And I also noticed that he has a lot of very strong morals about things, which I don't always agree with. So I didn't want to kind of go into borrowing his morals when I was copying him, because I was like, if I was really copying him, I would put some sort of Christian thing in here, but I don't want to, so I'm not gonna. So I guess the hardest thing was figuring out which bits I didn't want to use.
Unusual to see you write a male protagonist. Did you put some thought into that, or did you find that difficult? Or
I didn't really find it difficult. I just felt like it was a natural fit for the story, and I noticed that there was a type of character in Anderson's stories that I liked, and it was always like the earnest young guy who's doing his best. Now, I would say this fisherman is quite fickle and, you know, not like the best guy, but I think he's trying. And so thought that it made sense to try and kind of make him that archetype, but twist it a little bit. So that's kind of why he ended up as a fisherman and not like a fisherman's wife or something. Or I guess the other thing I could have done was done it from the mermaid's perspective. But again, I wanted to flip that from the original story, so I knew that I wasn't going to write as a mermaid. I was going to write somebody who met a mermaid.
We were talking earlier about how you wanted to make the story kinder and a bit less dark than some of the original elements of The Little Mermaid, like, for example, the fact that she had to cut out her tongue, for example. One thing I found interesting in the original compared to yours is that in the original, the witch is significantly more wicked, but she's also a lot more detailed about what the sacrifices are going to cost. However, in your story, there's that scene after he's transitioned and realised that he's given up his legs as well as his immortal soul. Was that something that you were thinking about when you were writing the story?
Yeah, I was thinking that in the original story, it's weird that she knows exactly what's going to happen, because sometimes you don't. If it was supposed to be about giving things up for your lover or changing yourself for your partner, sometimes you don't know the things that you're going to have to give up and change to be with them. And so I wanted to have Nerissa be dishonest. The other difference is that she's got a personal stake in this, whereas the Sea Witch, she just wants the voice right. Nerissa is trying to understand what the heck happened to her sister. So it's slightly different from that perspective. But from mine, it was because, yeah, I just felt like, well, sometimes when you go into something, you don't really know how you're going to change and what's going to happen. So it feels weird that in the original she knew exactly like the cost of it all. I mean, that's an interesting choice, but for me, I just didn't feel right. So I made mine different and not. Also, let's not lie, I just wanted the drama of having my main guy wake up with a tail and be like, what the heck has happened to me?
So this is the third of our sequel challenges. Would you have any tips for any of our listeners curious to try their hands at hashtag sequel challenge? It's not actually a hashtag, but it could be. It should be. What would be your sequel tips?
I think you should try and capture the spirit of the author without copying them completely. I think if you try and copy them completely, you end up with something quite rigid and unnatural. My other tip would be just read a lot of their work and try and figure out what makes them tick if you want to copy their style. So Hans Christian Andersen, I worked out pretty quickly that even though some of his stories are quite different, there's some things that are similar in all of them, such as the way he writes descriptions, the way he strings events together, and he has he's very emotional in his writing. So I didn't take like everything. I took a handful of things and decided to use them. And even doing that exercise without writing a sequel will help you become a better writer, because you're thinking about what you like in other people's work.
Listeners, if you do want to write a sequel, we would love to read it. Send us your work.
Yeah, please do.
Thank you for listening. Please leave a comment on our website to let us know what you thought. You can also find all our previous short stories and episodes. We'll be back with another story next week. Goodbye, and I hope you enjoyed my story.